Welcome back to Open Comments with me, Ash. In this episode, we'll be talking to Stuart Macgregor. Stuart Macgregor is the CEO of Real IRM and the Open Group South Africa. Through his personal achievements, he has gained the reputation of an enterprise architecture and IT governance specialist, both in South Africa and internationally. While participating in the development of the TOGAF standard, Stuart drove the adoption of TOGAF in South Africa and continues to evangelize the discipline of enterprise architecture and the Open Group standards across Africa through speaking opportunities, advisory engagements, and EA Masterclass, TOGAF, and Zachman Framework training. Now based in Plettenberg Bay, all Stuart's engagements are carefully scheduled around the tide tables and walks on the beach with his beagle, Roxy. In this episode, we'll be taking things back to his 1999 Proto-EA case study, ecosystem architecture and real-world application, and beyond. Let's dive in, shall we? Thank you, Stuart, for joining us today on Open Comments. To start with, in your 1999 Proto-EA case study, what were the earliest warning signs that static tools like ARIS were insufficient for modeling business dynamics?
Oh, thank you, Ash. It really started in, as you said, 1999 with the McKinsey proposal to South African Beer Division. I worked at South African Beer Division as the information resource manager at the time, and it was really a request for architecture work to look at the McKinsey proposal and how it would work in the beer division context. Inside South African Beer Division at the time, we had a number of modeling tools, ARIS, as well as some financial simulation tools. Why McKinsey suggested Vensim was to address complex systems dynamics, where the focus was on changing the price of beer. What would that mean to volumes? And the existing tool set simply couldn't handle that type of complexity and the need for simulations and Monte Carlo simulations across a really complex environment. So unfortunately, the proposal was not accepted, which was part of the frustration. In essence, the requirements exceeded that of static tools: unlimited size, game theory simulations, etc. And through that, kind of moved on into the SAB PLC Global IT Strategy Project, which is my next focus.
Thank you. And what mindset shift is hardest for experienced enterprise architects when moving from control-based design to adaptive ecosystem thinking?
That's a rather complex question. It's really to start thinking, what does our architecture look like, and start asking the question, really, what does our architecture do? What are the feedback loops that drive its behavior? In other words, it's a significant shift. It means drawing new types of models, like causal loop diagrams, not just simply your Archimate views as we typically do. It also entails identifying, reinforcing, and balancing loops in your business environment. And the dynamics are amplified. So it's understanding the difference between stocks and flows and how simulation is done, etc. Which is currently not done commonly across enterprise architecture teams, because it's more at a enterprise architecture for strategy level, I suppose. I think a key point is really to pick at a problem that the organization is grappling with. Ideally through where previous inventions haven't really worked.
Mm-hmm. And moving on to ecosystem architecture and real-world application. In the South African scrap metal ecosystem case, what surprised you most when modeling it as an ecosystem rather than as an industry value chain?
I kind of fell down a rabbit hole. It was really reading a paper that suggests state intervention in the scrap metal industry, and I read through the documents, and it kind of just really linear thinking. Mm-hmm. And because of that, I kind of fell down the rabbit hole, as I said, and started exploring the systems dynamics. But Real IRM, together with the members of the Open Group, we put together the first industry reference model within the Open Group, focusing specifically on exploration of mining metals and minerals. And in that particular piece of work, which has been widely used, thousands of downloads off the Open Group site, the process view as well as the capability map that was produced for mining really didn't tackle the complexities and the dynamics of a complex system. It was purely a process view and a capability view, typical TOGAF type of deliverables for an industry reference model. So, what was missing and what is missing is the ability to bring in systems thinking, into ecosystems. So the tooling has changed. The ability to use AI, things like crawled code and so on and so forth. Certainly has changed the way architects can add value into the organization, specifically with complex ecosystems.
Thank you. And how did reframing silos as ecosystem nodes change stakeholder conversations?
Really, dramatically. When you show regulators, in South African case, the receiving revenue, SAPs and ITAC, which is, all the different government departments, etc. View the organizations as node in a shared ecosystem. It really shifts. They stop being the center of their own universe and start seeing how their decisions ripple through actors that they've never sat in the room with. So the ITDC makes expert permit decisions, without visibility of the police force, the SAPS registration data. Then, another government department processes export duties without real-time links into other information. So, in other words, everybody seems to view, the world from their perspective, while from an ecosystem approach, you break that silo mentality. Where we had 5 uncoordinated agencies optimize their own nodes while the system decays. So everybody's trying to do what's right, with the best intention, but the net effect is that the system kind of implodes. So in other words, it's and also it's looking across the entire ecosystem. A node such as the waste pickers, that they it's a different way of kind of thinking, that they really are, key logistic providers into the recycling, sector. So the conversation can change about waste pickers themselves. So when you start thinking of the waste pickers as a key aspect, one of the primary nodes of collection into a subsystem, you need to change your thinking into the actual model itself. So almost getting back into target thinking, you're understanding who your stakeholders are, and but it's a wider spectrum of stakeholders, across government departments and it's the entire spectrum.
Mm-hmm. Moving on to probabilistic modeling and Monte Carlo in EA. How do you ensure that probabilistic outputs are trusted rather than dismissed as too theoretical?
I think it's going to become a core EA competence, and also kind of linking it to the people need to not see it as being too theoretical. So the way to tackle those is to ground in evidence that your stakeholders already know to be true. And that's one of the points coming out of the scrap metal work. It didn't open with equations. It opened up with the information that was already in the public domain, and that was coming from a lot of research that went into putting sources from government departments into people that have written around the sector specifically, and then it's pretty obvious because of the fact that cables have been stolen and the infrastructure has gone backwards. So in other words, there is a clear understanding from a mental model perspective because people actually see where it's going wrong. And then to show the correlation between export bans and theft reduction, and that came out of research as well. And what actually drove the change in understanding. So it's the sequence of the trust, the aligning of the public facts, show why the current model is failing, and then map the feedback loop, and then introduce the simulation itself, and then coupling that with hard numbers, data proof, showing the linkage between export bans and the correlation to theft reduction. And in the London presentation, one of the slides is a discussion between two personas, two AI personas that I've created, systems dynamic specialist and an enterprise architecture team, with systems dynamic specialist sent a note to the EA team, kind of highlighting as to why the conventional thought was not working. The way of tackling the problem. They're showing it, for example, a very low correlation between theft reduction and export bans, while in increasing security, physical security, cut the theft dramatically. And then also, I think one of the key aspects coming out of the ecosystem's work is the Viper score, which we probably should talk about as well. Where the system is quite clearly on the scrap metal system is clearly on a doom spiral. So hard to dismiss things that have been too theoretical is to ground it in real facts. Stuff that people could see, touch, and feel and experience. What it adds to the picture is the causal loops and the interdependencies between the factors that actually drive a changing system. Because you're merely thinking implement or requiring an export ban is going to fix the system was totally flawed. It had exactly the opposite effect that was required.
Mm-hmm. And do you see probabilistic modeling becoming a core EA competency in the next decade?
I think so. I think it definitely will. It's the ability to support boards make the right decisions. And there's a lot of research that's been done around what makes a high performance board. McKinsey also released a number of papers over the years addressing that specifically. And by adopting this type of approach, I think there's a clear way forward in that we can then answer questions which weren't easily answered before, and supporting the board reduce decision biases, as an example. We're coming out of Monte Carlo simulations. You can say, probabilistically, there's a 20% probability that this is going to work. So it's kind of it repositions the enterprise architecture capability to provide information through systems thinking, systems dynamics, business dynamics. We can directly reduce decision biases, and you can also start supporting the evaluation of resource allocation, assessing value drivers, and so on and so forth. It really positions the enterprise architecture practice to provide services which can drive positive change within the organization. So definitely, I see it becoming more and more important. I think also what another important factor is that the enterprise architecture team or practice are uniquely positioned where through their modeling, they are converting personal tacit knowledge into organizational knowledge and the ability to those know and those need to know together. So they're almost positioned as custodians of the intellectual capital of the organization. And then through applying engineering disciplines, the meta-model definitions, and the way that the graph databases are used, etc., uniquely positions the enterprise architecture team as a way of guiding effective change in the organization. So it's a change of focus. It's the management of intellectual capital as a resource.
Mhm.
But when it comes to the future of enterprise architecture, I think we definitely require that pivot, moving from static blueprints to dynamic ecosystems that breathe, adapt, and evolve.
Yeah.
Where at the core of that is the ability to manage intellectual capital as a resource, and by doing that, being able to guide that effective change within the organization in a far more agile, living, and dynamic fashion. And that's a direct change from coming forward with 3 to 5 year strategic roadmaps. Well, yeah, that's great to have, but is that living dynamic?
Mm-hmm.
Probably not. Where you can kind of start saying, well, from a probabilistic perspective, there's a 20% or 22% or 25% probability, that this is going to happen, and here are various alternative scenarios.
Mm-hmm.
Being able to simulate them, do comparisons, etc. And that provides the enterprise architecture team with the ability to support alternative policy discussions.
Yes.
Where should we evaluate resource allocation in the organization? Where does it make the most sense from a business value perspective?
Mhm.
How do we cut out decision biases? Because everybody has their own mental model. And I think through this approach, we kind of breaking that down. We can get people onto the same page, literally, by producing deliverables printed on A0 posters, where people can take a red pen to it. But then coupling that with the work coming out of the system simulation, being able to do systems dynamics and business dynamics simulations.
Mhm.
And that far exceeds current levels of capability.
Looking back at your 1999 Proto-EA work, what would you tell your younger self?
It's don't give up. Yeah, I think it's pretty much one of the key answers.
Okay, I like that. Okay.
To the younger self. It's the
Don't doubt yourself.
it's also sort of around. I typically, when I teach a TOGAF course, right at the beginning, I'd say, I must warn you that this particular course comes with a health warning.
Ah,
Because,
interesting.
once you've internalized what enterprise architecture is
Yes.
about, value it can add to organizations, it's going to be very, very difficult to get it out of the system.
Wow. Is it a type of thing as well that when they start saying, when they're like, you live and breathe something, would you say it's a bit similar to that as well?
Absolutely. In my case, people tease me. I say, well, I'm actually obsessed about enterprise architecture. I'm passionate about it.
That's good then. Yeah,
That
helps.
the fact that it's something I feel can really make such an incredible difference. And now I think that's one of the value
Mhm.
propositions coming out of the scrap metal ecosystems work, which is something which is quite new because of the fact that it combines TOGAF, systems thinking, systems dynamics, business dynamics, uses TOGAF as a structuring framework. So it builds on work that spans 35 years. Looking at the Zachman framework and the work I did as part of the SAP Knowledge Coordination Council, and presentations on using the Zachman framework to implement ERP systems, and the work that we did on exploration, mining metals and minerals, and the work that was done on the COVID standard, which kind of aligned COVID from an IT governance perspective with enterprise architecture through the work that was done in COVID version 5, and how that's been adapted by government in South Africa, where it's mandated by law, using COVID 5 and TOGAF as part of government requirement. That's certainly driven the understanding as to what enterprise architecture is about and the value it can bring.
Okay.
I think we're moving into a phase now, coupled with AI, this ecosystems, thinking, where the value proposition and the ability to add value quickly into organizations is becoming far more obvious.
Yeah. And at such a rapid pace as well, right?
it is such a rapid pace, but again, organizations need to not toss the baby with the bathwater in some instances, where the engineering disciplines, the focus on meta models and the way of systems thinking and systems dynamics, business dynamics still requires that intellectual rigor through the meta models and that type of stuff. The consistent modeling approaches and the use of standards and so on and so forth. But quite frankly, that's the type of stuff that you can put behind a brick wall. Your typical stakeholders, in fact, don't really care. All what they want is meaningful information that helps them make the right decisions and guide effective change into their organizations. So, one of the key messages, which I kind of like to make obvious to enterprise architecture practitioners, is this is really it's a field that you can grow, and it's a continual learning. And I think that's one of the key values coming out of the Open Group itself, is the ability to participate and to guide the standard and to work with people who are very knowledgeable in enterprise architecture and a whole number of sub-disciplines that kind of lead into it. Like, for example, if I had to think back, getting to the question that you asked around, what would I tell my younger self? I wish that I'd actually read work coming out of Danilo Meadows, that leverage hierarchy, as to when it comes to a system, what are your high leverage points and what are how you choose to prioritize them. And she's got a set of 12 factors, and typically organizations tend to focus on the low leverage ones. And this was glaringly obvious coming out of scrap metal ecosystems work. With the stuff or the actions required in order to drive positive and sustained organizational transformation or organization societal change. So it's more than just simply looking within the organization itself. Require a new way of thinking. It's almost like at a different level, and it's picking it from other disciplines. The work coming out of economists and systems thinking, people like Jay Forrester. So, if I had to look back, I certainly do not regret the path. I've certainly made so many mistakes over the years, and it's kind of, I think it's one of the key ways of learning is to pick yourself up and continue. And some things you need to unlearn.
Yes.
And And I'm really passionate about the focus on systems thinking, or systems dynamics, and business dynamics, because of the fact that it explains the complexity. It's that shift from linear thinking, coupling with AI, the ability to make it far more adaptive, because of the fact that you can feed it with various information sources and construct it in such a way that you can almost identify the gaps in the system. In other words, what is not known, using new forms of tooling, etc. So it's been a very, very exciting path. I certainly don't regret it. I'm very encouraged that work using TOGA as the absolute part of the foundation, and then also coming back to the work that Donald Zachman has done over the years. And being able to do things using AI that weren't that easy before, for example, where it's in Zachman speak, that detail is a function of depth within the cell, not a change of perspective. Those things have been easy to say, very difficult for people to internalize, sometimes more difficult to implement. But with the rapid advancements we're going through at the moment, I can see a clear way forward to pull a lot of these concepts together and make it really practical. So the world has certainly changed. It's a very exciting time for for enterprise architects and for the Open Group itself. So I think the value proposition for membership and participation is really clear. And so, specifically, into Africa, I'm looking forward to having more and more organizations join and collaborate and apply the enterprise ecosystems thinking into the way we drive transformation across organizations and across the continent.
Mm-hmm.
But I think that organizations that embrace ecosystem thinking will be running their strategy as a simulation, not as a document.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
The architecture repository will be far more live, to be fed by AI agents,
Yes.
continually updating as the environment changes.
Adapting, yes. Mm-hmm.
So it's adaptive, it's dynamic, it's living.
Mm-hmm. And ever growing as well, like it's because it's always changing and it's always adapting. It's very moldable in that sense that it's not restricted, it's not confined, it's ever moving with, as it changes, we change with it type of thing as well.
And it's managing intellectual capital is a key resource within the organization. So in other words, the way intellectual capital is structured into repositories, mm-hmm. how it's made accessible.
Yes.
How you can run simulations against it, looking at alternative.
Yes.
Policies. And then being able to look across discipline, into the finance world, being able to, for example, getting back to the SAB work, doing sensitivity analysis and doing things like economic value add calculations and updating models and really making it value adding. And also not only into strategic planning and financial management, but also into risk management. With the probability analysis and scenario analysis, making organizations far more resilient and adaptive. The world is changing so quickly.
Mm-hmm. Perfect. Well, thank you, Stuart, for joining us on the Open Comments podcast and giving us a fascinating glimpse back in time to your 1999 Proto-EA case study, ecosystem architecture and real-world application.
Thank you very much, Ash.
Thank you, Stuart. And to our listeners, Open Comments community, we hope you enjoyed this inspiring episode as much as we have. Until next time, stay safe and happy listening.